The scorching afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across Copper Ridge's main street when Sheriff Clay Madsen dragged his wife Martha from Doc Patterson's office. Her wrists bound in iron shackles that caught the light like cruel jewelry. Martha's bare feet scraped against the wooden planks of the boardwalk, her once pristine blue dress now darkened with perspiration and clinging to her trembling frame. The fever had been consuming her for 3 days, turning her skin pale as winter frost except for the unnatural flush burning across her cheekbones. "Please, Clay," Martha whispered, her voice cracking like dried leather. "I don't understand what I've done wrong." Inside her chest, panic clawed at her ribs like a caged animal. This morning, she had been lying in their marriage bed, weak but hopeful that the worst of her illness had passed. Now she stumbled through town like a condemned criminal, the metallic taste of fear sharp on her tongue, while curious eyes watched from doorways and windows. The shackles bit into her wrists with each jerky movement, and she found herself wondering if this was some fevered nightmare brought on by her sickness. "You're a danger to every soul in this town," Clay announced loudly, his voice carrying the authority of his badge, but none of the tenderness a husband should show his suffering wife. His weathered hands gripped the chain, connecting her wrists with practiced ease, as if he had done this countless times before. "Doc Patterson confirmed it. You've got the same fever that killed 3 folks over in Millerville last month." Martha's heart lurched. Doc Patterson had said no such thing during her brief visit to his office. The elderly physician had been gentle concerned, prescribing bed rest and willow bark tea. But Clay had cut the consultation short, claiming urgent sheriff business before dragging her outside. Now his lie spread through the gathering crowd like wildfire in dry grass. Mrs. Henderson clutched her infant closer to her chest. Old Pete backed away from the boardwalk, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. The blacksmith emerged from his forge hammer still in hand, his soot-covered face creased with confusion and concern. "The jail's the only place secure enough for proper quarantine." Clay continued pulling Martha toward the stone building at the end of the street. "Lucky for all of us, we've got a prisoner in there who's already been exposed to every kind of sickness imaginable. He can tend to her, and if she dies on his watch, well, he'll hang for murder right alongside the horse theft." Martha's legs buckled beneath her, sending waves of agony through her fever-weakened body as she collapsed onto the sun-baked dirt. The impact sent dust swirling around her face, and she tasted grit between her teeth as she gasped for air. Clay didn't pause to help her up. Instead, he yanked the chain upward with such force that she cried out, the sound raw and desperate in the afternoon stillness. Sheriff Madsen called Tom Bradley, the town banker, stepping forward with his hands raised peacefully. "Surely there's a more Christian way to handle your wife's illness. Perhaps we could arrange..." "The decision's made." Clay snapped, his pale eyes flashing with something that might have been relief if Martha had been thinking clearly enough to notice. "The prisoner will keep her alive, or die trying. Best motivation a man can have." Inside the jail, Isaiah Boone sat in his cell's corner, his dark skin gleaming with perspiration in the stifling air. At 28, he possessed the lean strength of a man accustomed to hard labor, but 3 weeks of imprisonment had left him gaunt, his cheekbones sharp beneath eyes that held the wariness of someone who had learned to expect cruelty from white men in positions of power. The shackles around his wrists had worn permanent grooves in his skin, reminders of his current helplessness. He had been riding through Copper Ridge when a wealthy rancher's prize stallion had vanished from the livery stable. Being a stranger and a black man traveling alone through hostile territory, Isaiah had been arrested within hours. His protests of innocence, his documentation proving he had purchased his own horse legitimately in the previous town, his offer to help search for the missing animal. None of it had mattered to Sheriff Madsen, who seemed eager to close the case quickly and quietly. The heavy oak door groaned open, and Clay shoved Martha through the entrance. She stumbled forward, her fever-clouded vision failing to register the stone walls and iron bars, until Isaiah caught her gently in his arms. Her body radiated heat like a furnace, and he could feel her ribs beneath the thin fabric of her dress as she sagged against him. "She's your responsibility now, boy," Clay declared, his voice echoing off the damp stone walls. The sheriff's keys jangled as he locked the cell door with deliberate slowness, as if savoring the moment. "Keep her breathing until the fever breaks, or I'll see you swing from the hanging tree for her murder." Clay's boots echoed down the corridor and out into the street, leaving them alone in the musty twilight of the jail. Martha's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy, struggling to make sense of her surroundings. The cells smelled of unwashed bodies, damp stone, and something else, something metallic that she couldn't quite identify. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of the town outside. Isaiah studied this white woman, who had been thrust into his care, the wife of the man who held his life in his hands like a loaded gun. During his years on the Maxwell plantation in Alabama, he had often been called upon to tend sick slaves when no white doctor would come. He recognized the signs of serious fever, the burning skin, the rapid, shallow breathing, the way her body alternated between violent shivers and complete stillness. "You're in the jail, ma'am," he said quietly, tearing a strip from his already threadbare shirt. The cotton was rough but clean, the best he could offer. "But don't you worry about that right now. Let's see about getting that fever down." He dipped the makeshift cloth in his small tin cup of water, the same cup that held his daily ration, barely enough for one person in the desert heat. The water was warm and slightly stale, but it was all they had. Gently, he pressed the damp cloth to Martha's forehead, watching as some of the tension left her face. Martha's eyes focused on him for the first time, taking in his prisoner's clothing, his shackled wrists, the unexpected kindness in his weathered features. In her fevered state, nothing made sense. Why would her husband lock her up with a criminal? Why would this stranger show her more gentleness than Clay had managed in months? "And why would you help me?" she asked, the words barely more than a breath. Isaiah met her gaze steadily, his calloused hands careful as he adjusted the cloth on her burning forehead. "Because you haven't done anything wrong to deserve this suffering, and I can't stand by and watch an innocent person die if there's something I can do to prevent it." As the long afternoon wore on, Isaiah worked tirelessly to break Martha's fever. He gave her small sips of water from his cup, re-wetting the cloth whenever it dried, and positioned her near the single barred window where occasional breezes provided brief respite from the oppressive heat. The stone walls, designed to hold heat during winter months, now trapped the summer air like an oven. Martha drifted in and out of consciousness. But during her lucid moments, she began to speak, first in fragments, then in longer passages that revealed the truth of her marriage to Clay Madsen. She had been 19 when they wed, a banker's daughter, who believed that Clay's stern demeanor masked a good heart beneath. For 8 years she had endured his increasing coldness, his long, unexplained absences from their home, the way he spoke to her as if she were an unwelcome burden rather than his chosen companion. "He used to bring me wildflowers," she said weakly as the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the barred window. "In our first year of marriage, he would pick them from the hillside behind our house. Little yellow ones that smelled like honey. I pressed them in a book, thinking they meant he loved me." Isaiah continued, cooling her forehead, saying nothing but listening intently. On the plantation, he had learned that sometimes the act of speaking helped people heal, as if releasing their pain through words lessened its power over their bodies. "The flowers stopped coming after our first anniversary," Martha continued, her voice growing stronger with memory. "And then he started staying out all night, claiming sheriff duties. When I asked questions, he would—" She touched her left wrist unconsciously, where Isaiah noticed faint yellow bruises that were weeks old. "A man who truly cares for his wife doesn't hurt her," Isaiah said quietly. "And he sure doesn't chain her up and throw her in jail when she's sick. That's got nothing to do with you and everything to do with what's gone wrong inside his heart. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Martha's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. Her fever spiked dangerously high, and violent tremors seized her entire body. Isaiah had rationed their water carefully throughout the day, but now he used every drop remaining to cool her burning skin, pressing wet cloths to her wrists, her neck behind her ears, anywhere her pulse hammered too rapidly beneath her skin. By midnight, she had begun to hallucinate, crying out for her mother who had died when Martha was 12. Isaiah held her hands, gently speaking in low, soothing tones about anything he could think of, the changing constellations visible through their window, stories his own mother had told him before she was sold to a different plantation, descriptions of the Ohio River, where he had briefly tasted freedom before bounty hunters tracked him down. "My mama used to say that suffering shared is suffering halved," he told her as she shivered in his arms. "And joy shared is joy doubled. Maybe that's why the Lord puts us in each other's paths when times get dark." Just before dawn, as the first gray light filtered through the barred window, a distinctive rattle cut through the morning stillness like a blade. Isaiah's blood turned to ice water in his veins. In the corner of their cell, coiled and ready to strike, sat a massive diamondback rattlesnake that had slithered through the window bars during the night, seeking cool shelter from the desert heat. Martha lay unconscious against the far wall, her breathing so shallow he had to watch her chest carefully to confirm she was still alive. The snake's wedge-shaped head swayed hypnotically, its forked tongue tasting the air for threats. One bite from a snake that size would kill either of them within hours, and the nearest antidote was probably in Santa Fe, 3 days' hard ride away. Moving with infinite care, Isaiah reached for the empty water bucket that sat beside his sleeping pallet. The metal handle was cold against his palm, slick with condensation from the desert's brief morning coolness. The snake's rattle intensified as it sensed movement, its muscular body coiling tighter in preparation for a lightning-fast strike. Isaiah had killed rattlesnakes before, during his time working the fields, but never while chained, and never with an innocent person's life hanging in the balance. The shackles around his wrists limited his range of motion, and a miss would likely result in the snake striking Martha instead of him. With a sudden fluid movement born of desperation and long practice, Isaiah brought the bucket down hard on the serpent's head. The impact reverberated through the cell, and he struck again immediately, then a third time, until the snake lay motionless in the corner. The effort had torn fresh cuts in his wrists, where the iron shackles bit deep and blood ran down his forearms to drip onto the stone floor. When Martha woke an hour later, sunlight was streaming through the window, and Isaiah was cleaning his wounds with water he had saved in the heel of his worn boot, a trick learned during his days of hiding from slave catchers, when every drop of moisture could mean the difference between survival and capture. She stared at the dead snake in the corner, then at Isaiah's bloody wrists, then at his face. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice stronger than it had been since their imprisonment began. "So could you," Isaiah replied, simply tearing another strip from his shirt to bind his wounds. "And you've got a lot more life ahead of you than I probably do." That afternoon, Clay returned to the jail, but he was not alone. Deputy Lucas accompanied him, a young man, barely out of his teens, with earnest brown eyes and hands that shook slightly when he was nervous. Clay announced that both he and Lucas would be leaving town for several days to join a posse tracking outlaws who had reportedly robbed a bank in Millerville. "The jailer's coming with us," Clay said, standing outside their cell with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. His voice carried a tone of false regret that set Isaiah's teeth on edge. "We need every able-bodied man for this hunt. You two will have to manage on your own until we return." He set down a small wicker basket containing 2 loaves of stale bread and a clay jug that sloshed with perhaps a quart of water, barely enough to sustain 1 person for a day, let alone 2 people for several days. Martha struggled to sit up, her face pale, but her eyes clearer than they had been since her arrival. "Clay, please," she said, her voice carrying a note of desperate reasonableness. I need medicine, proper food. I can feel myself getting weaker by the hour." Clay looked at her with what might have been pity in a more generous man, but his pale eyes held only cold calculation. "The fever will either break on its own or it won't, Martha. Nothing more can be done. If God wills you to live through this trial, you will. If not—" He shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its indifference. Deputy Lucas shifted uncomfortably beside the sheriff, his young face troubled. "Sheriff, maybe we could ask Doc Patterson to check on—" "Doc's already done what he can." Clay cut him off sharply. "And he agrees with me that quarantine is the safest course for everyone involved. We leave within the hour." After they departed, Isaiah divided their meager supplies with mathematical precision. He soaked the bread in water to make it easier for Martha to swallow, giving her 3/4 of the ration, while taking only small pieces for himself when hunger became impossible to ignore. The water he portioned even more carefully, allowing Martha regular sips, while he moistened his lips only when thirst threatened to cloud his judgment. By the second day, Martha's condition had stabilized somewhat, but she remained dangerously weak. Isaiah attempted to improve their situation by bending the iron bars on their window, hoping to create better airflow in the stifling cell. The metal was old, but still strong, and his efforts succeeded only in cutting deep gashes across his palms without loosening the bars even slightly. The stone walls, which had been quarried from local limestone, seemed to absorb heat during the day and radiate it back at night, creating a cycle of constant discomfort. On the evening of the third day, storm clouds began massing on the horizon, like a dark army preparing for battle. The air grew heavy and oppressive, thick with moisture that made breathing difficult. Lightning flickered in the distance, and the wind began to howl through the gaps in the jail's construction, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, something that spoke of violence and change. When the storm finally hit Copper Ridge, it arrived with devastating force. Rain poured through their barred window in sheets, soaking everything in the cell within minutes. But far worse than the water from above was the flood that began seeping up through cracks in the stone floor as the storm overwhelmed the town's inadequate drainage system. Within the first hour, several inches of muddy water covered the cell floor, turning their small space into a cold, filthy swamp. Martha's condition deteriorated rapidly in the damp, chilled air. Her breathing became labored and irregular, each breath a visible struggle that sent waves of panic through Isaiah's chest. Using the wooden frame from their cell's single bunk, Isaiah managed to construct a crude platform that lifted Martha above the rising water. The work was exhausting, made more difficult by his weakened state and the shackles that limited his range of motion. Soon he found himself standing waist-deep in the murky flood, supporting Martha's weight, while fighting his own exhaustion and the growing fear that they would not survive the night. The water continued to rise, inch by terrifying inch. When it reached Isaiah's chest, he climbed onto the platform beside Martha, pulling her close to share what little body heat they both retained. Their single oil lamp flickered dangerously low, threatening to leave them in complete darkness, with the flood still rising around them. "I'm going to die in this place," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind and driving rain. "No," Isaiah said, his voice carrying more conviction than he felt. "We're both getting out of this alive. I gave you my word on that, and I don't break promises to people who depend on me." But as the water lapped at the edges of their makeshift raft and the storm showed no signs of abating, Isaiah began to fear that his promise might be one he could not keep. The platform groaned ominously under their combined weight, and he could feel Martha growing weaker in his arms with each passing hour. It was then that a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the night sky, and through the driving rain, Isaiah heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching the jail at a gallop. A single horse and rider appeared through the storm, and moments later, Deputy Lucas burst through the jail door, his young face pale with terror and his hands shaking as he fumbled with a ring of keys. "Deputy Lucas." Isaiah called out relief, flooding through him like warm honey. "Thank God you're here. Martha needs medical attention immediately." But Lucas didn't move to unlock their cell door. Instead, he stood frozen outside the bars, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his brown eyes wide with guilt and fear. Water from his soaked clothes puddled on the floor around his boots, and Isaiah could see that the young man was trembling not from cold, but from some terrible knowledge that was eating him alive from the inside. "I can't do this anymore," Lucas said, his voice cracking like thin ice. "I can't be part of this evil any longer." "A part of what?" Isaiah demanded, a cold dread settling in his stomach. Lucas glanced around nervously, as if afraid that someone might overhear their conversation, then stepped closer to the bars. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but his words carried the weight of absolute truth. "There never was any posse, Isaiah. Sheriff Madsen rode straight to Millerville to meet with a woman named Catherine Walsh. He's been carrying on with her for months, maybe longer. I followed him there, and I heard them talking." The revelation hit Isaiah like a physical blow. "What did you hear?" Lucas's face crumpled with shame and horror. He told her that Martha's death would solve all his problems, that once she was gone, he could marry Catherine without the scandal of divorce or the legal complications. He laughed when he said it, Isaiah. He actually laughed about his wife dying alone in this cell. Martha had been listening despite her fevered state, and now her eyes went wide with recognition and dawning horror. "The quarantine story," she whispered. "There never was any quarantine, was there? Doc Patterson never said you were contagious." Lucas confirmed miserably. "Sheriff Madsen invented that story to justify putting you in here. And the threat against Isaiah that was just for show to make the townspeople think he cared about keeping you alive." Isaiah felt rage building in his chest, unlike anything he had ever experienced, even during his darkest days of slavery. "How long has he been planning this?" "I think since your illness started," Lucas said, tears mixing with rainwater on his cheeks. "Maybe longer. Catherine Walsh has been pressuring him to leave you, Martha, but divorce would ruin his reputation and probably cost him his job. This way, he gets what he wants and comes out looking like a grieving widower who did everything he could to save his beloved wife." Martha's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of 8 years of marriage to a man who had never truly loved her. "He brought me flowers once," she said distantly. "In our first year together. I thought they meant he cared. There's more." Lucas continued, his voice breaking completely. "I heard him tell Catherine that once you were dead, Martha, he'd arranged to have Isaiah transferred to the territorial prison. And during the transport, he couldn't finish the sentence. He'd kill me too," Isaiah said grimly. "No witnesses to testify about what really happened here." Lucas nodded miserably. "I rode all night to get back here. I won't be part of murder no matter what it costs me." He stepped forward with his keys, but as he reached for the lock, a gunshot exploded through the storm like thunder. The young deputy jerked backward, a red stain spreading rapidly across the front of his shirt. He stumbled against the bars of their cell, his keys falling from nerveless fingers to disappear into the floodwater, with a soft splash that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence following the gunshot. "Lucas." Isaiah reached through the bars, catching the deputy as he slumped forward. "Told you that prisoner was dangerous," came a drunken shout from outside the jail. Through the rain and darkness, Isaiah could see 3 figures approaching Tom Bradley, the banker, along with 2 other men he didn't recognize. All 3 carried rifles and had clearly been drinking heavily, their movements unsteady, but their intentions unmistakably violent. Shot the deputy trying to help them escape. One of the men yelled, his words slurred, but his voice carrying easily over the storm. "We need to finish this before that killer hurts anyone else." Lucas coughed blood frothing on his lips as he struggled to speak. "The keys," he gasped, pressing something small and cold into Isaiah's hand. "Backup key, in my boot. Always carry one." As the young deputy went limp in his arms, Isaiah frantically searched Lucas's body with his free hand. In the rising floodwater that now reached his neck, he found a small brass key wrapped in the waterproof oilcloth inside Lucas's boot, a precaution that would now save their lives. Martha, now fully alert despite her illness, grabbed Isaiah's arm with surprising strength. "Leave me and save yourself," she said urgently. "I'm too weak to run, and you have a chance if you go alone." "Absolutely not," Isaiah replied firmly, fitting the key into their cell lock with hands that shook from cold and adrenaline. "We're both getting out of here alive no matter what it takes." The lock turned with a satisfying click. Just as the three armed men burst through the jail door, their rifles raised and their faces flushed with alcohol and misguided righteousness. Isaiah grabbed Lucas's revolver from the deputy's holster, pulling Martha behind him as bullets began exploding around them, chipping stone from the walls and sending fragments flying through the air. "Don't move another step," Isaiah shouted, aiming the gun directly at Tom Bradley's chest. "I'm not the criminal here, and you just murdered an innocent lawman." "You killed Deputy Lucas," Bradley yelled back, his rifle wavering in his drunken grip. "We saw you attack him." "Look at the angle of the bullet wound," Isaiah commanded, his voice cutting through their alcohol-fueled confusion. "The shot came from outside this building. You shot a good man who was trying to save lives." For a tense moment, the three men hesitated, uncertainty creeping into their whiskey-clouded minds. Isaiah used their confusion to his advantage, keeping the gun trained on them while helping Martha toward the cell door. "Put down your weapons and let us walk out of here," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "Martha needs medical attention, and every second we waste arguing is another second closer to her death." One of the men, a ranch hand Isaiah recognized from the livery stable, slowly lowered his rifle dout, replacing aggression on his weathered face. "Tom, what if he's right? What if we made a mistake?" "Shut up, Carl," Bradley snapped, but his own confidence was clearly shaking. "He's a horse thief and a murderer." "Then why did Deputy Lucas come here alone in the middle of the night?" Isaiah pressed. "Why would he risk his life to help us if I was really dangerous? Use your heads instead of that liquid courage you've been drinking." The logic of Isaiah's words penetrated their alcohol-hazed thinking just enough to create doubt. Using that moment of uncertainty, Isaiah helped Martha pass them toward the jail's exit, keeping the revolver trained on the group while moving backward step by careful step. They almost made it to the door before Bradley's paranoia overcame his doubt. "I don't care what you say," he screamed, raising his rifle again. "You're not leaving here alive?" Isaiah pushed Martha through the doorway just as Bradley fired. The bullet whistled past Isaiah's ears so close he felt the heat of its passage. He returned fire, not aiming to kill, but to wound, sending a bullet into Bradley's shoulder that spun the banker around and sent him crashing into the stone wall. The other two men scrambled for cover as Isaiah and Martha plunged out into the raging storm. More bullets followed them as they ran, but the rain and darkness made accurate shooting nearly impossible. They reached Doc Patterson's office, just as Isaiah's strength finally gave out, his legs collapsing beneath him as they tumbled through the unlocked door. The doctor's office was empty. Patterson had evacuated with most of the town's residents when the flooding became dangerous. But his medical supplies remained, and for the first time since this ordeal began, Isaiah had access to proper medicine and equipment. Working by lamplight, while Martha rested on the examining table, Isaiah drew upon every bit of medical knowledge he had gained during his years of slavery. He found willow bark for Martha's fever-clean bandages, for both their wounds, and laudanum for the pain that racked both their bodies. Most importantly, he located a bottle of quinine, the standard treatment for the type of persistent fever that had been consuming Martha's strength. As he worked, Isaiah told Martha about his life before Copper Ridge, about learning basic medicine from an old slave named Samuel, who had been trained by a doctor in Charleston, about the night he had finally escaped the Maxwell plantation, and about the year of freedom he had enjoyed before bounty hunters tracked him down in Kansas territory. Samuel always said that healing was about more than just medicine. Isaiah explained as he wrapped clean bandages around Martha's wrists where the shackles had chafed them raw. He said it was about giving people a reason to fight for their lives. You gave me that reason when you trusted me to care for you, even though everything in your experience should have taught you to fear me. Martha's fever finally broke just before dawn, and color began returning to her pale cheeks. As her strength slowly returned, she looked at Isaiah with clear eyes for the first time in days. You saved my life, she said simply, but the words carried the weight of absolute gratitude. We saved each other, Isaiah corrected gently. You gave me something to fight for when I had given up hope of ever being more than someone's property. That's a gift I can never repay. When Sheriff Clay Madsen returned to Copper Ridge 2 days later, expecting to find his wife dead and his problems permanently solved, he instead discovered a town in complete chaos. The story of the jail shooting Lucas's heroic attempt at rescue and Isaiah's protection of Martha had spread throughout the community, faster than wildfire in dry grass. More importantly, Deputy Lucas had left a detailed written statement with Doc Patterson before riding to the jail. That fateful night, a complete account of Clay's confession to Catherine Walsh, his plan to let Martha die, and his intention to eliminate Isaiah as a witness. The young deputy had been more intelligent and conscientious than anyone had given him credit for, and his foresight would now serve justice even beyond his death. Judge Samuel Morrison, a stern but fair man who had served the territory for over 20 years, called for an immediate hearing in the packed courthouse. The entire town seemed to crowd into the building, eager to hear the truth about their sheriff's actions and the prisoners who had become local heroes overnight. Martha's testimony was clear and devastating. Speaking in a steady voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom, she described 8 years of increasing abuse, Clay's suspicious behavior before her illness, and Isaiah's selfless care during their shared imprisonment. Her words painted a picture of a marriage that had been built on deception from the beginning, and a man who had been willing to commit murder to escape the consequences of his choices. Isaiah Boone showed me more genuine kindness in 3 days than my husband managed in 8 years of marriage. She testified, looking directly at Clay as she spoke. While the man I had sworn to love and honor was plotting my death, a stranger who owed me nothing risked his life repeatedly to keep me alive. If that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about their respective characters, then nothing I say will matter. The charges against Isaiah were not only dropped, but officially expunged from all records. Judge Morrison apologized personally for the injustice he had suffered, and several prominent citizens offered him employment opportunities on the spot. Tom Bradley and his 2 accomplices were arrested for Lucas's murder, though Bradley's lawyer would later argue that they had acted in defense of the community based on false information provided by the sheriff. Clay Madsen was arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, abuse of his office, and fraud in his false quarantine declaration. The evidence against him was overwhelming, particularly Lucas's written statement and Martha's detailed testimony about his behavior leading up to her imprisonment. His affair with Catherine Walsh was exposed, publicly destroying both their reputations and any chance Clay might have had for leniency from the judge. At his sentencing, Clay showed no remorse for his actions, claiming that he had been driven to desperate measures by Martha's constant illnesses and demands. Judge Morrison was unmoved by this defense, sentencing Clay to 25 years hard labor in the territorial prison, effectively a life sentence for a man of his age and reputation. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning that painted the mountains surrounding Copper Ridge in shades of gold and crimson, Martha walked the short distance from her new cottage to the small cabin behind Jameson's livery stable. She carried a carefully wrapped package in her hands, and her step was light with purpose. Isaiah had accepted work at the stable caring for the horses and equipment that kept the town connected to the wider world. The job paid well enough for him to rent the cabin and begin building a life based on his own choices rather than the whims of others. It was honest work that allowed him to sleep peacefully at night, knowing that every dollar in his pocket had been earned through his own efforts and integrity. "I wanted to thank you properly," Martha said when Isaiah opened his door, holding out the wrapped package with a smile that transformed her entire face. "And to give you something that belonged to someone who would have admired what you did." Inside the package was a gold pocket watch, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. The inscription on the back read, "To Marcus Sullivan with love and gratitude from his daughter Sarah." Martha's maiden name had been Sullivan, and the watch had belonged to her father, a man who had built his banking business on the principle that character mattered more than color or circumstance. "This was my father's most treasured possession," Martha explained, her voice thick with emotion. "He carried it every day for 40 years, and he taught me that time is the most precious gift we can give another person. You gave me time when my own husband was willing to let me die. You gave me hope when I had lost all faith in human goodness. And you gave me my life back when everything seemed lost." Isaiah turned the watch over in his hands, understanding the profound significance of the gift. "I can't accept something this valuable, Martha. This should stay in your family." "It is staying in my family," she replied firmly. "You're part of my family now, not by blood, but by choice and shared suffering and mutual respect. My father would have been proud to know that his watch was carried by a man of your character." Martha had used the small settlement from her divorce to purchase a cottage on the peaceful side of town, where she had established a successful seamstress business. Her skill with needle and thread, combined with her reputation for honesty and fair dealing, had quickly made her one of the most sought-after dressmakers in the territory. For the first time in her adult life, she could walk down any street without fear, make her own decisions, and speak her mind without worrying about the consequences. "Will you stay in Copper Ridge?" she asked, watching as Isaiah carefully fastened the watch chain to his vest. "I believe I will," Isaiah replied, checking the time on his new treasure. "It's the first place that's ever felt like home, instead of just a stopping point on the way to somewhere else." They stood together on the cabin's small porch, looking out over the town where they had both nearly died, and where they had discovered that human decency could survive even in the darkest circumstances. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke from evening fires and the promise of new seasons ahead. "Thank you, Isaiah," Martha said quietly, "for showing me what real kindness looks like, and for proving that a person's worth has nothing to do with the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth." "Thank you, Martha," he replied with equal sincerity, "for trusting me when you had every reason to be afraid, and for teaching me that hope can survive even when everything seems impossible." As Martha walked back toward her cottage, where warm lamplight glowed in the windows and supper waited on her own table, Isaiah pulled out the pocket watch and opened its cover. The hands pointed to 6:30 in the evening, the exact time when their ordeal had begun 6 months earlier, when Clay had shoved her into that jail cell and changed both their lives forever. But now, instead of marking the beginning of their suffering, the watch marked the start of their freedom. In the distance, the sounds of construction rang out as the town continued to rebuild what the great storm had damaged. The old jail had been torn down, completely replaced with a new structure that featured proper drainage, larger windows, and cells designed for human beings rather than animals. Tom Bradley had been sentenced to 10 years for Deputy Lucas's death, though he would be eligible for parole in 5. His companions had received lighter sentences in exchange for their testimony about the events of that night. The trial had divided the town temporarily, But justice had ultimately prevailed, and the community had emerged stronger for having confronted the ugly truth about their former sheriff. Isaiah closed the watch and slipped it back into his vest pocket, where it would tick steadily against his heart for the rest of his days. Tomorrow he would return to work at the livery stable, caring for the horses that carried people to new destinations and new possibilities. It was meaningful work that connected him to the rhythms of daily life in Copper Ridge, and it paid well enough for him to consider someday purchasing his own small spread of land in the valley beyond town. The evening star appeared in the darkening sky, bright and constant above the mountains that surrounded their small community. In the distance, Martha's cottage glowed with warm light, a beacon of independence and hope. In a world that too often showed neither quality to people like them, Sheriff Morrison, elected to replace Clay in a landslide vote, had proven himself a fair and competent lawman who judged people by their actions rather than their appearance. Isaiah walked back inside his cabin, where a simple but satisfying supper waited on the table and a book of poetry, a gift from the town's schoolmarm, who had taught him to read during the long winter evenings, sat open beside his plate. The pocket watch would rest on his bedside table that night, and every night thereafter, its steady rhythm a reminder that time could heal even the deepest wounds when people chose compassion over cruelty. In Copper Ridge, justice had been served to people who had every reason to lose faith in humanity, had instead discovered it in each other. And the watch that had once belonged to a banker who believed in human dignity continued its eternal marking of moments, carrying forward the enduring power of decency to transform even the darkest circumstances into something approaching grace.